Welcome to the All Things Wildfire podcast, where we delve into the latest trends and hot topics in protecting properties against wildfire. So sit back, relax, and join us as we arm you against disaster.
All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another session of All Things Wildfire. Today's guest is Mr. Justice Jones. Mr. Justice Jones is a Wildfire Mitigation Officer in Austin, Texas. And I got to tell you, my friends, you're going to want to listen into this conversation. The research that I've done on him, he is extremely passionate about wildfire prevention and has had this desire to, to want to really impact people and the environment in such a way that I think it's going to be entertaining for you. But really, also, this is to me a champion in fighting and doing what we can do in the wildland-urban interface with regards to wildfire. And the cool thing that I'll just add really quick, and Justice, I'll let you talk about this in the future in a few minutes. You're also in charge of code compliance, it looks like, or you're leading the way in code compliance. And here in California, we have, I think, probably cutting-edge codes that many states don't have. So let me introduce Mr. Justice Jones. And really quick, before I give you the mic, Justice, joining us today is Mr. Rich Snyder, former fire captain for Sierra Madre here in California. And I wanted to kind of bring Rich into the conversation because, you guys are both from the fire service and you have fire service talk, and there's some things that just fly over my head that I don't understand when you guys are talking about some of these things. So stand by, guys, for a very engaging conversation. Mr. Justice Jones, thank you for joining us, my friend.
I'm excited to be here. I'm a real big fan of the show, and the work you're doing to get this information out is crucial right now.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Now, you say it's crucial right now, and it's interesting because, I've been engaged here. I've been doing disaster restoration for 26 plus years, but wildfire prevention, less than 3 years. You've been doing it for a couple decades. And you say it's important right now, which is so interesting because oftentimes we feel like the labor that we're doing, and in your case, I feel like it's partially a labor of love of what we're doing. It's like it doesn't come full circle. But I have to agree with you right now, Justice. I think right now, my friend, the attention that wildfire is getting is absolutely across the board, whether it's the environment, whether it's insurance, whether it's politics, whether it's just fire itself. It is like everything is engaged right now, probably more so than ever before. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on why you feel like it's at the top of what needs to happen right now with people's awareness.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's starting to enter into more a global consciousness. Wildfire isn't just a California issue, like I think most people in America grew up thinking. It's an issue for our entire nation and for the globe. I also believe very much that change begins in people's hearts and minds, and that this is a cultural problem first, not a built environment or a ecosystem management problem. If we can change people's consciousness to understand that we are a species adapted to fire and we have an important role on this planet, and if we don't own that role, then it upsets the balance of our ecosystems and our planets and our lives. And so it's critical for us now to align our cultures with the environments we live in, because not doing so is irrational at this point. And it's starting to become more and more apparent, the consequences of not being compatible with our environments. And then we can talk about the ways to become compatible, but if we don't have that recognition that humans are a fire adapted species, that most of the fires that occur on this planet are caused by us, or at least certainly in this country, over 90% of them are human ignited. We have to take ownership of fire and release this victim mentality that we're just being impacted by fire. Fire is being affected by our actions and our behaviors, the same way we are being affected by fire. And so if we change our actions and behaviors to align with our fire environment, things are going to go much better for humanity as a whole.
Boom. Holy smokes.
Yeah.
Justice, we've been on here for like, what, a minute and a half, and you're dropping bombs like that? Rich, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, living with wildfire, this is not something that we're going to stop, or we're going to lessen it and try to control it, but it's there. And like Justice says, it's a cultural thing. For years, we've been enforcing, WUI codes in California, since like 65 is when the brush management programs came in, and we've been trying to control it or influence people by laying down the law, enforcing codes, and instead of trying to educate, well, we've been educating and trying to educate people that the wildfire's there, and this is how we're going to live with it. We're not going to stop it. So when that fire comes, the goal is let it come through and let's, survive it. But it's a cultural community shift. I think back to, the seatbelt laws, Pete, you and I have talked about this where, early 80s or late 70s, you had to put seatbelts on, and they were saying, you have to wear your seatbelt. And people were upset about that. You can't, I'm a private citizen. You can't tell me to put a seatbelt on in my car. I'm driving. And then they started giving tickets and people were upset. Well, you fast forward 30 years, when you get into a car, if you don't have your seatbelt on, you think something's wrong. And that's the way fire prevention's got to go. And it's education and people just understanding that we're not in a helpless situation. We're not victims. We can survive this. We can live with fire.
Mm-hmm. Justice, man, I'm still chewing on the things you said, man. So I think the education needs to continue to expand and to permeate into communities and neighborhoods and homes. However, it's the first time I've heard someone elaborate how you did, and it landed. This is how it landed for me. What you just said, okay, which is my thinking is people have been educating homeowners, and they're like kind of poo-pooing, like, oh yeah, the wildfire thing, it's not my problem. It's the fire department's problem, and I don't have to worry about anything. And then the hammer starts to show up with the insurance companies, okay, and they're like, oh my God, I'm a victim now, right? Why poor me? And there's this mentality of really forcing people to deal with wildfire. And when I listen to what you just said, I feel like people really need to engage emotionally and embrace the reality that we are ultimately responsible for what's taking place, and really like internalize emotionally that we have the power to do something about it, and we're not the victim, and this is not something that's impossible. We just have to agree that, hey, we're going to live with wildfire for the rest of our lives, and then something else is going to come up. But for now, we're going to really embrace this and take it in, and really help our own families, and then help our families across the street, and then help the other families across the street, and really just make this a community thing. But I feel like there's some love in there that I'm hearing, that I think, man, no one's ever approached that way. And this is how I'm internalizing it. I don't know how the listeners are internalizing what you just said, but I think it's very powerful. And I think, let me ask you, Justice, in your communities, and I see, I look at a few different screens that I've got here, you're doing a lot of work. What is some of the feedback that you're getting from the communities with the work that you're doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd just like to start by saying there's not anything I think that I've been a part of in my career that wasn't collaborative. And I say that because this isn't an issue that individual agency, organization, or entity can solve. It really takes a community to prepare for wildfire. So what we like to say in Austin is that wildfire is everyone's fight. Now, the fire department's job in that fight might be at the end of the hose, but you as a homeowner, this is the new face of the volunteer fire service in America, is you're personally responsible for your property protection, not because we don't want to save you, because there's not enough firefighters in the country to save everybody who's threatened by wildfires. So I think part of it starts with having the tough conversations and being honest with people about our capacity to save them. And once they have a realistic expectation outcome, then they can make informed decisions. But generally, the fire service mentality is, we got this. Don't worry, you paid your taxes. That's why we're here. We got this. And the reality is, the tough thing needs to be said is that we don't have this when it comes to wildfire, that we need your help, that we can't do this alone, and that you're a part of this solution. I think it also helps to put wildfire in the context of life safety, and that's the fire department's, first priority. And most of the agencies I've worked with over time, life safety is the highest priority. But when we talk about wildfire, it's very often we jump straight to vegetation management or even structure hardening, and both of those I'm a huge advocate for. But we're not talking about it from the standpoint generally that wildfire is a threat to your life safety and your family's life safety. Let's start there. How do you survive wildfire? That gets people listening, and it's the truth. It aligns with our priorities as a public safety agency. What can you do to own that role, to be responsible for you and your family, to make sure they have the best possible outcomes as are out there? And then how do you create an environment that lends itself to operational success? So when and if a firefighter shows up, they're able to defend to your home. And guess what? If you're in a neighborhood with limited egress and you can't get out of the neighborhood, your home might become your last resort survival area. So how do we start having the conversations about homes, not from the standpoint of just protecting homes, but protecting homes because you might have to be in that home? And we've experienced that in Texas, and I know you've experienced it in California. And so your home might be your last resort survival area. And if we start the conversation there, it really adds a sense of urgency. And so that's where we start in Austin. It's like, let's start first with how you're going to survive a wildfire. I know you're worried about your house. We're going to get there. Your house is part of that solution. But it really takes a community to brace for this. And hearing it from multiple perspectives, I think, is helpful. So they hear it from city leadership, they hear it from the fire department, they might hear it from the park ranger or code enforcement. And so everybody has one message, but many voices.
Boom. Wow. And I think, one of the things that really stood out to me, what you just said, Justice, is that really for the fire department to be honest and transparent and vulnerable in saying, and I'm not saying that they're not, I'm just saying, like, I feel like a message needs to come out and say, hey, we don't have the capacity, and here's the thing is that, we as, the normal person driving around, we see a fire truck, like, boom, those are our heroes. They're the guys, they got our back, right? And then they take on the hero mentality as they should, because, like, they're going to get our back. Man, the trouble is that it's a false sense of security. And by the message going out more and more saying, hey, man, like, we're here to help, but we don't have the capacity and we need your help. And I think when the community understands that our firefighters need our help, like, we're going to run to them because they've been helping us for many, many years. And I really do think that's a really interesting message that I think can touch people's hearts and say, okay, we really need to buckle down, because if we need to shelter in place and we have nowhere to evacuate, I've got to make sure that my family's safe, because, my firefighters may or may not be able to get to me and to my community. And now what should I do? So awesome message, awesome thoughts there. Justice, I know that like you're the leader in your community, and I know that you come with a lot of support, and you're working with a lot of people to make this happen. What do you see for your area in Austin that has been working for people to actually take action? Is there any one thing or a group of things that you've been doing that you're like, hey, this is working, we see some progress, and we should double down on those things? Do you have anything like that?
Yeah, I think it's a process. So if you'll bear with me, Austin was one of the first cities in the county we're in, Travis County, to develop a community wildfire protection plan. And that plan outlined our strategies for wildfire mitigation, preparedness, and response. And what's important is that plan was adopted by the city and the county. And so what that did is it gave all the city and county employees the empowerment to understand and take on their role in wildfire adaptation. So I think the first step for us is we weren't on the same page originally. We used that plan and the risk assessment to create at least a common operating picture of what the risk was and those potential impacts to the 28 endangered species that we have in Travis County, or the 2 million people who are at risk in the county and the city combined. So that was the first step. And that forced also our leadership to recognize and adopt that plan and own that plan. And so that created leadership intent. And I think that's really important in any community or any jurisdiction, is to make sure that you have the support that you need. From there, we identified things that were of highest priority. And again, like I mentioned, we focused on evacuation planning as our first priority because life safety is our first priority in the fire service. And so we developed one of the first city-county wildfire evacuation plans. And part of the message is if your government is taking so much time and effort to invest in wildfire safety, maybe you should take this serious too. And so we developed the plan in mind where it could support community level efforts. And one of the recommendations in that plan, that broad plan, was to push this information down into the community level and all the way down to the homeowner level. So for example, Austin leads the nation and the state in the number of nationally recognized FireWise communities. We've taken those 23 FireWise communities and formed an alliance of community members that are helping each other learn and lessons learned and the things that are working and didn't work, and implement those, and really becoming a multiplier effect for us, where we wouldn't have the capacity with 200 people a day moving to Austin to really have that reach. And so those communities cover about 50% of the high risk areas in Austin. And if a homeowner from one of those communities calls and said, hey, I'd like a risk assessment, we're able to direct them back to the community where we've taught those community members how to do risk assessments, and just leverage that capacity. And so we've taken that plan and we've pushed it all the way down to individual ownership level. And I think that's been really important, that we have both the leadership intent and that grassroots level activity. Otherwise, you just got a good document on the shelf if it's not a living plan. And so we're moving into the update of that plan. And one of the things that we're going to be sure to include is projections on climate vulnerability, like not where we are right now, but where we can anticipate being. How do we skate to that puck of wildfire risk and anticipate that? And how do we make sure that we're equitable and inclusive, and we bring everybody who's vulnerable along with us, not just the folks that have perceived risk or squeaky wheels, those that are working too hard to even maybe stop and take the time to recognize wildfire risk. How do we reach everybody who needs this information? And so we're working to make sure that as we move forward, we're incorporating more and more best practices in that process, always knowing that we need the combination of that leadership intent and that grassroots buy-in to really affect change. And then the city and county employees show up to support the public in their efforts because they're informed and they know how to ask for help now.
Leadership intent and boots on the ground. Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, and the other, the benefit of that, the other thing that's also critical is being consistent with the message across the board, and that everyone has the same information. Because we've seen that where different cities or different organizations will all well-intentioned, but have different goals, different hoops that they're setting up, different priorities. And what's happening in California now is with CAL FIRE, OES, and the forestry, everyone's trying to get on the same message so we're consistent, because it can be confusing for people out there when they're hearing different things from different, be it AHJs or individuals in the profession, hearing different messaging. We're seeing that in the insurance industry right now, with where we're getting requests for, well, this insurance company says you have to box your eaves. It's like, well, you've also got to do your vents, and everyone's kind of piecemealing it, and we got to be consistent with our messaging. So that's really important with what you're doing, as bringing everyone together as one message and one work group like that. That's awesome.
Justice, we can learn from what you and your team are doing, and I'll definitely connect with you afterwards too, because we're involved in communities, and we keep coming up. Like I'm part of our own Fire Safe Council, and there's a level of frustration, I guess, when I listen to the leaders there, and they're not getting the attention from the people, and they're not, getting the involvement. And I feel like, just like a business, if the business isn't doing well, you don't look at the employees and say, hey, you're not doing your job. You look at the leadership and say, hey, the leader is the chokehold of the business. And when you as a leader admit that, then you say, okay, if that's the case, then great. Let's do something. And so I that landed really good for me. I think 100% the leadership has got to be intentional on what they want to communicate, what the intention is, and then deliver that message in such a way that it's an inspiring vision for people that are boots on the ground to get behind this vision and say, let's go and let's do this together. And I love the fact that, when someone says, hey, I needed a wildfire inspection, you've trained the community to be able to say, I got you, I got this, I'll take care of it, because the fire department is already tapped with, how many they can do, and utilizing the resources of the community to really get behind this cause of managing the risk of wildfire. I think it's amazing. So we'll definitely, Rich, just remind me, we'll definitely connect with Justice to get some of his tips on how to make that happen. Justice, as we were speaking earlier, and I look at your the history of what you've been doing for a couple decades of your life. Can you talk a little bit about how you got to this place? I know that back in 2004, I think it was, you were doing some stuff in the forestry. But my question earlier to you was, how did you get into this, and how did the path get directed to you? Like, yep, this is what I want to do at such a young age. That, well, I don't know how young you were, but 20 years ago, you decided this is the path I'm going to. Can you kind of elaborate on how that took place?
Sure. Yeah, I think I mentioned I was always fascinated with fire. I spent time growing up on the West Coast and got to witness and experience the force of wildfires. And I think as a kid, it was just fascinating from the perspective of fire behavior and just the intensity of those fires. But it wasn't until I was about 18 years old, I joined the Air Force, and I was sitting in the airport on my way to Desert Storm, and I decided to develop a list of goals for myself. And I figured starting with 10 would be a good start when I didn't have any goals other than to survive the next 4 years. And so I wanted to set something after the war for me to aspire to. And so when I got out of the Air Force, I went straight into college, and I got my degree in environmental resource management and cultural anthropology. And that was just what I was interested in. It wasn't until I looked back years later at that list that I'd made that I had sent to my father in a package of my Air Force stuff I didn't get to keep. And on that list was bringing Native American land management practices back into use. And I remember when I found that, we were in the process of planning a prescribed burn, and I didn't really know what that meant when I wrote it. But when I realized that prescribed fire is the tool that Native Americans use to manage the landscape, to coexist safely with these fire adapted environments that we live in. It really kind of gave me a sense that I was on my life's purpose or the right track. And then from there, I think, to be honest, I followed every step that was laid out in front of me, and they led me here based on that passion and interest. From there, I took a position right out of college with a little village in New Mexico called Ruidoso. And Rich is probably familiar with Ruidoso. At the time, it was one of the most at-risk communities in the country. And they were one of the first communities outside of California where we adopted a vegetation management standard and a code similar to a WUI code. And that came with its challenges. It's a bunch of West Texans living up in the mountains in New Mexico, and every tree is sacred. And so I learned that it wasn't the code that was going to give me the ability to make change. It was influence and the ability to communicate with homeowners about the benefits of taking these actions, of being part of a community that's preparing together. And that just stuck with me. And from there, I was recruited by the Texas A&M Forest Service to coordinate statewide wildland urban interface. And I just took that same mentality with me. But Texas and New Mexico are different places, and Texas is very averse to regulation. It's still the Wild West, and I was born here. I get it. I don't particularly like being told what to do if it doesn't make sense, especially. And so I knew that was going to be a real challenge, but I wanted to do something that was going to last, that was going to be sustainable. Rich, you know this, you've been on probably a million fires, and you put them out and it's done and over with, and you probably went back a few years later and put another one out in the same spot. And so I started asking, how can we have a meaningful, lasting impact? And where that landed was back to the code. How do we enact permanent change? But I recognized that in Texas, it wouldn't happen without buy-in. And so we backed way up, and we started having conversations at that foundational level with all of our partners, maybe even to the point where we were over-inclusive, because we knew we were going to move forward with something that, if it's adopted in Austin, the state capital, it might have implications statewide, and not everybody may be in favor of that. In fact, we had state legislatures who didn't support the adoption of the code, but we knew in our hearts it was the right thing to do for the residents of Austin, to protect them and protect future residents, because it sure would be nice to move into a house that you didn't have to worry so much about, and that you could maintain, that you had a sense of security associated with it. So that took years of stakeholder buy-in and inclusion, but we knew that it would have a lasting effect. That was very much a team effort. I helped initiate the code, but the entire community brought that forward, to the point where when we're at City Council on adoption night, unsolicited, our Firewise community showed up and signed up to speak and said, we need this code for all of us. Do the right thing, adopt this code, and support the fire department and this sustainable effort. And so we were successful mainly because the community supported the code, not just because the code made perfect sense. It's the logical thing to do. But in Texas, we've got to want to do something. We got to understand it to buy off on regulation. And that's what it really took, is a lot of stakeholder engagement and input. And it was that culmination of starting out with that lesson and carrying that with me until the time was right for me to implement that again in Austin, which we have. And we're proud to say that we've protected thousands of homes from the WUI code, and we're starting to get interest in people voluntarily complying with the code, because we're getting those insurance letters now that you've been talking about this whole time. It's happening in Austin. And so we wanted to at least create an environment where residents could point to the code saying, hey, I'm following the national standard. Can you consider the things I've done in your decisions to renew my policy? So it's a long-winded answer to your question, but it started in those early days, and I carried that ethic through me to now.
I love that. Now, okay, so I got a few questions for you. So you said you were at the airport. You're going off to Desert Storm, and you wrote down that you wanted, and I'm going to hack this, but you said something about Native American land management.
Mm-hmm.
Like, who says that, right? What does that even mean? And I guess the question I have for you is, like, are you Native American? Is that why this is hit you so hard? I mean, how do you think that came to you?
Yeah, partially I think I was just a weird kid and I thought about stuff like that. I was always fascinated with indigenous cultures, globally, including, Native American cultures. My ancestry, part of it is Basque, which are the indigenous people of Spain. My daughter's Native American, but I think it was mostly just this recognition that somebody was doing it right for a long, long time. It was sustainable. How do we get back to that? And part of living right was there weren't a whole lot of permanent settlements and dwellings in these fire prone ecosystems. And if they were sure designed to withstand wildfire. So those little lessons that no one else seemed to be paying attention to were really interesting to me, the compatibility with our environment. It seemed to be the only logical outcome is for us to become a fire adapted species once again, like the ancestors of this land did. It worked for eons. How can it not work for us? We just have to align with that mentality. And the reality is, I'm realistic. I know we're not going to burn our way out of this, but we can't have fire adapted communities and ecosystems without reintroducing fire wherever we can. It's part of that solution. And so I think it's just one really important aspect. And it was the part of fire that I could wrap my mind around is human use of fire was most interesting to me.
Wow. Okay. Awesome. Love that. Um, you had mentioned something about Texas and because it's your community and you admitted, hey, we can't just ram code down people's throats because it's not going to stick, right? We don't want to be told what to do. And I think that's not just true of Texas. That's true of just people in general. But in Texas, man, like people are carrying guns and stuff like that. So it's a little bit different. But
Why couldn't you just tell them California's doing it? We should do what California does.
They love that.
Right.
Why wouldn't that work?
Well, half of California landed in Austin, so we might be able
Well,
to track it down.
that's true. Austin, that's probably helped you out with the amount of Californians in Austin. Is Austin in Texas? I don't remember.
It's an island.
It's an island. Okay, love it. Now, Justice, you said something, and I don't know if I wrote it down afterwards, but I felt like you said instead of trying to force people to do things, you inspired people to do things. I don't know if I caught that word or not, but what you did something different other than just forcing people. What did you do? Generally speaking or specific, if you can remember to get people to rally behind this.
The first thing I did was look back to those who had made efforts to adopt the WUI code in the past. And what was somewhat terrifying is they were really, really smart people. Some of the best in their industry, some of the people who helped design the WUI code, who initially put it forth for adoption and summarily got shot down. And so I went and talked to the people who were smarter than me that didn't succeed and asked them how to move forward. And they said, across the board, we underestimated stakeholder buy-in engagement. To us as engineers, this makes perfect sense. What didn't make sense was to the environmental community that there might be impacts, or for urban forestry, they might care how this is going to affect their performance measures in the city, or water quality protection land. And so they sent the real clear message that it's not the fire service that you have to convince. It's not the engineers. If you give them a code, they'll implement it. It's the community that you need that buy-in from. And there was a lot of apprehension about what this code would mean. Is it going to affect people's watersheds and landscapes, or are we just talking about predominantly structure hardening? And we'd also educated our land managers to know that the home ignition zone, the area directly around homes, was the area where we could have the greatest impact. And so they wanted to hold us to that ethic of the science says it's the home, let's start there. And so it took a lot of real honest conversations with our partners, a lot of working groups, but mostly it took listening to people's values and helping them understand how the WUI code relates to those values. Some of the biggest adversaries in the initial adoption were fellow city employees. That's what killed our code adoption right out of the gate. It never made it to the Home Builders Association. There was too many internal concerns. So the first rung is to get buy-in at the internal level. And one thing that helped me is because it's difficult to be a prophet in your backyard. We worked with a group, Headwaters Economics, to come in and develop a report for us called the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire Report. And essentially that report reflected all the things that we wanted to accomplish, but in an objective way that was from a third-party think tank. So we'd say, this isn't just Justice Jones' agenda. This is the right thing to do based on an objective assessment. And we think we can minimize the negative impacts and maximize the positive aspects of it. So that first level was getting buy-in at the city level. The next level was the building community. And we started out real early with them in conversations. And some of those conversations were challenging at first. You know, they're there to build houses and make money, and anything that slows that down is a real concern. And so right out of the gate, they were less concerned with the cost than they were the time frame. And so I had to make a commitment that I wouldn't bring this to fruition without the resources to implement it. And we stuck to that. We asked for a budget request from city council to say, this is what we need to get started. But guess what? We're going to make that back in a year in permit fees. You just have to trust that process. And so that meant the permit process wasn't going to be slowed down, and we wouldn't inherit an unfunded mandate, which happens sometimes with these codes. And we'd have the resources to meet those expectations that we created with our stakeholders. And so it took that broad buy-in to be successful the second time, and working really hard not to miss anybody who had a role and input in this process. I think we were ultimately successful because it was supported by the community, not by the fire department alone.
Wow. And Rich, I'll have you touch on this a little bit, because I think most of the listeners don't understand, like I didn't understand, I don't know if it's politics, but the business behind city. And so in what you said, Justice, is number one, you got started on the community level in working with people and the stakeholders that were involved. And then you had to also deal with the city and explain to them how this is making sense. And so I feel like the fire service is a key component of connecting the dots, or connecting the bridge, or creating the bridge to make this work. Because, you know, on boots on the ground, you can have a fire-wise community or a fire safe council preaching and teaching and getting buy-in. But if we're not going and connecting the dots to the fire service, and the fire service then champions the message to the city to get funding and get permission and get things rolling, I feel like if those two things are not working hand in hand, there could be a large disconnect, and which would cause a lot of frustration and pain and time when putting these two together, running simultaneously, could really make a faster impact. Would you agree with that, Justice?
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Okay. Any thoughts, Rich, on the challenges with cities or the business part of it?
Sure.
In your experience?
Yeah, and you know, government is government. We started working on the WUI code in California in 1993, and we got it adopted in 2007. So that's how the gears move, or how slow they can move. And with the fire service, you know, they're so understaffed, especially when it comes to prevention and you know, getting this type of stuff done. You know, they really have to work together through, you know, local FPO groups and things like that. The other thing is the fire departments can be limited, handcuffed when it comes to code. They can enforce code, they can talk about code. And there's been many times where I went out and did an inspection for code and said, yeah, you know what, you meet code, but you're not going to survive. And as a government employee, I can't take this one house of 5,000 houses and spend 3 hours with them and say, look, you should do this. I know it's not code, but this is the science, and this is the science. So it's limiting. And that's where the fire safe councils, the firewise communities, some of the wonderful work that Berkeley's done, and now with IBHS, getting the science behind it, so the fire departments can direct people to those resources and can be a partner in this. We talked earlier about, you know, the firefighters are the heroes, and I'll tell you, I was one for 36 years. I'll take it, but that only goes so far. The voice of the fire department is only going to take it so far. The other part of the educational component is to have people understand the reality of firefighting. We talked earlier about, people see the fire engine go by, they got it, fire department's got my back, and they don't. And like we said, it's not that we don't want to, it's just the resources are not there. I've been on countless strike teams. My last one at the Calder fire, I'm at a base camp and there was probably 1,000 firefighters, and we go off to our assignment and I'm on a 3-person patrol truck and we're assigned down this 1/4-mile road, and there's 3 of us protecting 12 houses and doing what we can to prep. It was just a bad situation. We got run out by the fire. We lost 11 of the 12 houses. And one of the comments we heard, I became friends with the one home that survived, and OP is aware of this. We actually got it all on video. They had a Ring camera that recorded everything. And we're documenting why this one house survived. And we've heard some reaction from one of the neighbors saying, why couldn't they save us? Where was the fire department? Fire department was there. There's 1,000 firefighters that are covering 100,000 square acres, of fire. And the thought of, well, we need more firefighters. It's not practical. You can't put that much iron on the road, that many personnel. A structure fire, when you've got a house burning, NFPA says you need 15 firefighters minimum. And I can tell you in real life, it's 25 to 30 firefighters for a house fire. Well, you've got 10 houses going down this 1/4-mile road. Where are you going to get the 250 firefighters that you need to fight those houses? And where are you going to get the 100 fire engines to go down this? So I think people having an understanding of the limitations of firefighters out there, the type of gear we have to wear, structure versus wildland, the tactics, the life, the life safety of the firefighters, the insurance on your house is not enough to cover the insurance on my life. So I think some of those realities, the fire service has to admit to these, I'm not going to say weaknesses, but admit to the lack of where we can't do it all. And that's, the fire service wants to be able to do it all, and they do it all. But in situations like this, they have to, kind of get out there and say, no, we're not all that. We don't have all that lined up.
I think that goes back to being honest and vulnerable in their limited capacity, like Justin shared earlier. Justice, I'm looking at a huge air tanker on my screen over here. Does that belong to Austin?
Yeah, Austin coordinated with the Texas A&M Forest Service to establish a temporary tanker base at Austin Bergstrom, in which we help staff when they're active. So it's a statewide resource. We know that it's going to be available to go where the greatest need is, but we also want to contribute to the fire community as a whole. So whether that aircraft flies over Austin or flies over Dallas, we're supporting those operations.
Wow, fantastic! That's amazing. Now, Justice, as we come to a close here, thank you again for taking the time to speak with us. I'm curious as to what your future is looking like. What do you see for yourself now, having gotten to this place of the significant things that you're accomplishing, and maybe in your mind it's not enough, but what do you see for yourself as a trajectory in the next, say, 5 years? What are you seeing for yourself?
Yeah, it never feels like quite enough.
Right.
I would like my life to have an impact as broad as possible and help as many people as possible. I do work on the side to help communities outside of Texas, and I really enjoy that and teaching and educating people. I think one of the things I'm most passionate about is the reality is there's nobody in the wings waiting to grow up to be rich or a justice or an OP right now. There's no clear path for a 5-year-old to go, you know what, here's how I'm going to contribute to the betterment of my community or humanity. I'm going to focus on wildfire adaptation. And so until we start that stream of the next generation moving up into these roles, it's going to be folks like us kind of cobbling these skills together to be able to meet that demand. And what our society really needs is a new generation of fire adapted humans. And I don't see a lot of work going into that. So that's an area that's long term. That's, 20 years from now. But if we don't want to be in the same place we are now, struggling to have the resources and the expertise to address this, we better start now. And that I think is doable. I think that's something that youth would want to contribute to their society if they knew it was a real thing. So how do we make that real? How do we make it a part of our society? And I think, back to the Native American society, who were the warrior clan that protected their community? How do we get that next generation of wildland or firefighters who have that skill set, or just people who can contribute in the way that they can? It doesn't have to be at the end of the hose, to be a part of this solution. And so I'd really like the next part of my life to really focus on building humanity's capacity to confront this threat and move into harmony with our environment.
Wow, that's powerful.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I just wrote down a phrase: fire adaptive warriors. That's what I've got, man. Fire adaptive humans. If we, yeah, that's a big goal. But you're right, Justice. It needs to be consistent. Like we have to, we will continue to do our part to get the message out, to educate, and to really inspire people to understand what we can do, what it takes to impact not only our own properties and families, but our neighbors and our communities around us.
Cultural shift is not going to happen overnight. It's not next month. We're talking decades to bring this to fruition where it needs to be. And I already retired once. I'm not here for another 30 years, but you're right. We need someone to carry this torch, for lack of a better word. When we're done, where's it going to go from there? So yeah, the California Conservation Corps is doing some wonderful stuff with that, with their program shifting into fire prevention and things like that. But yeah, we need to bring it into schools. We need to create the people that are going to take it on for us.
Love it.
Yeah.
And Justice, what I'm going to do in 2024, we have, and for the listeners too, I'll announce this. We've had some very powerful, intellectual, intelligent people on this podcast. And when you bring together all the different pieces and the fragments, you can see that there's really a beautiful tapestry here of, like, I call it badassery, of people and their thoughts and their wisdom to really put together and be able to move some mountains here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to coordinate for those that are available on the previous podcast guests to be on one podcast together. And I got to tell you, Justice, like I'm already thinking about a handful of people I can connect you with. Not that you need it, but I feel like you desire this too, because you want to continue to grow and to make impact. And so we can do that through community and through our connections of people. One good connection can make a massive difference. So that's going to be coming in 24. And I'm excited about getting that group together to really collaborate and just have fantastic conversations on how we can break through some of the ceilings that we're coming up against with our own local areas and what we're doing. Justice, is there anything that you want to leave the listeners with before we sign off here today?
Yeah, I just like to remind people that we all have a role in wildfire. And so if you don't know your role, find somebody like Rich or myself or OP, and we'll help you figure it out and get you engaged in the solution.
Boom. We all have a role, and it's a matter of time before we're going to have to be evacuated. That's just the reality of the life that we're living right now. And so why not be prepared, informed, and really understand what that means to us and to our families. Mr. Justice Jones, thank you so much. God bless you, brother. We're behind you. We will do whatever we can to support the movements that you're making there in Austin, and bring some people together to see what we can do collaboratively. So thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed the conversation. Y'all take care
Great
and keep
seeing
up
you.
the great work.
Great seeing you. And yeah, reach out if you need any help. We're here.
I sure will. Thanks, Rich. It's a pleasure meeting you. And good job on hiring Thayer.
Yeah, that was powerful tool as well for children and adults. You know,
Absolutely.
knowledge is power.
Now, Justice, you mentioned earlier in our conversation that you came to Malibu, which is where we just had massive wildfires here 3 years ago. Probably one of the biggest wildfires on record in California, and I was a part of that. Meaning that I was part of the resources after the fire to help people either deodorize their home or rebuild their home, and it was catastrophic. It looked like a war zone. But tell me, you were just there in Malibu. What was the purpose that you were there, and what did you experience while you were there?
Yeah, I was there teaching a class for NFPA, and on the breaks, many of the attendees were homeowners, and they would just come up to me and said, I'm still recovering from the fire. My house has been rebuilt, but I haven't. I every time I smell smoke, I'm back in it. What can I do to get past this? Questions like that. And then what we're seeing across the landscape is entire towns are being annihilated. This is like the Dust Bowl days. And what's being left behind is communities with the entire community experiencing some level of PTSD, both at the individual level and at a collective level. And the realization that I had is that when folks know that there's a threat and they're aware of the threat, in a way it inoculates them against the surprise of that impact. And it's the surprise psychologically that often results in PTSD. And so one of the things that we can do to protect the public, and especially young people who feel less power in responding, they can't even get behind the wheel and run away like adults can. That wildfire is a thing. They may experience it, but they also have a role in that wildfire, and that there's a plan in place, and that their parents have thought through this process, and their family units have thought through this process, and they understand what that plan is. I've seen that protect and buffer people from the negative consequences of wildfire. We had the worst wildfire in Texas history in Bastrop in 2011, and we asked the National Fire Protection Association to come in and do some research with us on the impacts of that fire. And they focused on middle-aged school children, and they lumped them into 3 categories. One category is the family knew nothing about wildfire potential, and the kids didn't either. The next category is, well, mom or dad knew, but they didn't want to scare anybody, so they just kept it to themselves. Maybe even they had a plan. And the third category is the whole family knew. They talked about it. They talked about their family fire evacuation plan, and everybody had a role. It might just be grabbing the photo album or your stuffy, but you had a role in that wildfire. And when they measured the levels of PTSD, surprisingly, it was the kids that knew that wildfire was real, that it was going to potentially happen, and their family had a plan that had the least instance of PTSD. The ones where dad or mom just had a plan and didn't communicate it, the kids were equally as affected as if there was no plan whatsoever, because in their mind, it's just chaos. And so communicating the potential outcomes of wildfire with kids earlier than we think they're ready is how we're going to protect them, because they're being impacted before we're able to have this talk very often.
Wow, man, with mental illness running rampant already in our state, in the United States, to add this to it, you know what, Justice? Thank you for sharing, because that's I've never thought about that. As far as the lasting impacts that wildfire has on a individual, and then how that's being transferred down to our children if we're not careful, right? And so imagine, we love our children and we raise them, and how sad is it that we want to protect them so we don't tell them about the dangers, because we don't want to frighten them, we don't want to scare them, but by doing so, we torture them for years to come in having to relive this anxiety and this stress. I mean, my friends, like we need to start talking about it much more frequently, and have real meaning behind it. And just as you said that, not only talk about it, but let people know what their role is in the evacuation or in this wildfire situation. So that 100% would help it. Wow. So these people, you're in Malibu, they're asking you, how do I deal with it? Like what things can people do now? Not that you're a psychologist, but any thoughts on look, number one is prevention, right? Whether it's wildfire or PTSD, like let's prevent some of this stuff, which is amazing. But now after the fact, what have you seen anything that's helped people?
Yeah, I think even though people may take steps towards, say, hardening their structures and having a plan, there isn't a real solid belief sometimes that's going to protect them. And so using science to help reinforce that if your structure is ignition resistant, and you manage all those points of ignition, the likelihood of it igniting is really low. And so you've taken control over your ignition potential, and then you won't have to experience that again. And so I think it's been powerful just to give people solutions and to know that the fire service is standing behind those solutions, that they aren't a guarantee, but they're a best practice, and that they give you the greatest chance of survival and being safe, and just giving them that empowerment. We like to say in Austin, we want to move people from at risk to empowered as quickly as possible. And that risk is I don't know, or I just found out I got a problem, and the empowered is I'm part of the solution now. Maybe it's not the same role as a firefighter, but it's an important role, and it's an important role for my community or my family. And to know that role and be a part of the solution cuts through a lot of that chaos for people in their minds and gives them a sense of place in the midst of a chaotic situation.
Boom.
Yeah, and I think part of the PTSD is during an event, it's chaotic. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if I'm going to survive. I don't know where to go. I don't know if my home's going to survive. And if you empower people ahead of time that, yeah, I am going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, that fear of the unknown is part of that scar that's created on the PTSD, where I was so afraid. And so if we pull that back, we did the same thing with earthquake preparedness. We didn't have earthquakes for quite a while. Then 86, we had the Whittier, and people created stressors. Once we started educating people of what earthquakes are, how they work, the things you can do to prevent things from falling in your house, it relieved the stress of the earthquakes. And so that has to happen with wildfire preparedness. It needs to happen in schools. Everyone just needs to know that you're not a victim. You are not helpless.
Mm-hmm.
You can survive this. And when it happens, if you've got a plan, the stressors are dramatically decreased, and that's going to reduce the PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Man, Justice, you keep dropping bombs, brother. I love it. So I wrote down that you want to move people from risk and empower them as quickly as possible. And I think that's a really cool tagline to really help people. Like you said, they become aware, boom, and it's just a shift in their mind to say, hey, now I'm going to be empowered, and I'm going to do what I have to do. Yeah, my heart goes out to people that are still reliving the nightmares. Like you'd said earlier, the homeowner says that when they smell smoke, they get it almost, reignited, if you will, to that fear. And it reminds me of I was probably in the 4th grade, and there was a vehicle. Some crazy guy came in and he started skidding around the basketball courts there. And all I heard was a tire screeching and then a massive boom. He had hit a wall. And it's crazy because years later, probably even till now, anytime I hear screeching, like boom, I'm right in that moment, and then I'm waiting for this big bang to happen, and I'm shaking. And so, man, how stressful it is for survivors to be able to have these triggers, whether it's visual or audible or they smell something. Any other thoughts on PTSD, Justice?
Well, I think if we take that exact situation, and if you've been in the ball court and one of your friends has said, "Hey, OP, I know this knucklehead, he's going to come in and do a couple of donuts. I bet he hits the wall." And you were standing there anticipating that, it would have been a different experience, right? And so how do we make that expected? How do we prepare people for what's coming? And I think that's the inoculation from fire that we can offer people. And then maybe some of those kids that we start having these conversations with young want to grow up and protect the rest of us when it comes time for them to contribute to society. And so I think we need to back up and start at that earliest rung of our ladder, so to speak, and start bringing everybody along with us in this journey.
That's all for this episode of All Things Wildfire. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to our show and follow us on social media to stay up to date on all things wildfire. And as always, thanks for listening.